In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a shocking murder disrupts the peace when retired solicitor Lawrence Redding is poisoned at Mrs. Henshaw's charming tea shop. Enter Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming elderly spinster with a razor-sharp mind, who notices the scattered sugar cubes, and a mysterious woman in a grey coat. As whispers of a scandalous past involving a contested will and a tragic accident surface, Miss Marple unravels a web of vengeance and betrayal, setting a clever trap to catch the killer before they strike again. Will her keen insight reveal the truth hidden in the village's cosy facade? Chapter 1. The Village of St. Mary Mead. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Danemead, casting delicate shadows across the worn Persian rug in Miss Jane Marple's drawing room. She sat in her favourite armchair, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her nimble fingers guiding knitting needles through loops of pale pink wool. From her window, she commanded a view of St. Mary Mead's High Street, where the butcher's van trundled past and Mrs. Price Ridley's terrier yapped at a passing cyclist. The village, nestled in its quiet corner of England, seemed to hum with the gentle predictability of a well-wound clock. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and blue beneath her white hair, missed little. She noted the postman's lingering chat with the baker's wife, the hurried step of the vicar's housekeeper, and the unfamiliar motor car parked near the Blue Boar. St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to strangers, and Miss Marple, with her knack for observing human nature, found them particularly interesting. Her thoughts, however, were momentarily distracted by the clink of china as Cherry, her young maid, brought in the tea tray. "Lovely day, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Cherry said, setting down the pot with a cheerful clatter. "Though I heard there's been some fuss at Mrs. Henshaw's new tea shop. Everyone's talking about it." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "Fuss, Cherry? Do tell me more." Cherry, always eager for a gossip, leaned in. "Well, it's that Mr. Redding, the new gentleman at Rose Cottage. They say he's been in the tea shop every morning this week, always at the same table by the window. But yesterday, Mrs. Henshaw said he was asking odd questions about who comes and goes and whether she keeps the sugar locked up. Can you imagine? Sugar!" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "How curious," she murmured. "Mr. Redding, you say? I believe I met him at the vicarage last month. A retired solicitor, I understand. A quiet man, but—" She trailed off, her mind sifting through impressions. Lawrence Redding had struck her as reserved, with a guarded manner that suggested a man accustomed to keeping secrets. His eyes, she recalled, had darted nervously when the vicar mentioned old London cases. The tea shop, Mrs. Bantry's latest venture through her cousin Clara, Henshaw, had opened only a month ago, transforming the old haberdashery into a charming nook of chintz and polished wood. Its tables, adorned with crisp white cloths, drew villagers for afternoon tea and the chance to exchange news. Miss Marple had visited once, at Mrs. Bantry's insistence, and found the scones passable, though the jam lacked the tartness she preferred. More intriguing were the patrons, the usual villagers of course, but also a handful of outsiders, tourists perhaps, or something else entirely. As Cherry prattled on about the tea shop's popularity, a sudden commotion outside drew Miss Marple's attention. Young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, pedalled his bicycle down the high street at a reckless speed, his cap askew and his face as white as the flour sacks he sometimes delivered. Miss Marple's needles stilled entirely. "Something is amiss," she said softly. Moments later, Cherry burst back into the room, her apron twisted in her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. They've just found Mr. Redding, dead as a doornail, right there in the tea shop, slumped over his table, with his tea spilled everywhere. Dr. Haydock's there now, and they're saying it might be poison." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. her expression calm but her mind alight with interest. Poison, you say? In the tea shop? Dear me, how very extraordinary. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I think, Cherry, I shall take a walk. Fresh air is so clarifying, don't you think? Cherry blinked. You're going to the tea shop, aren't you, miss? To have a look? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I'm going for a walk, Cherry. But if my path should lead past Mrs. Henshaw's establishment, well, I dare say I might glance in. After all, one must keep abreast of village affairs. As she donned her hat and gloves, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lawrence Redding, a solicitor, retired, with no apparent ties to St. Mary Mead beyond his rented cottage. Why had he been so curious about the tea shop's sugar? And why, in a village where everyone knew everyone's business, had he remained so elusive? She recalled a remark he'd made at the vicarage, something about old debts that had made the vicar's wife frown. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, was rarely as simple as it seemed, and death, especially by poison, had a way of uncovering the most carefully hidden truths. Stepping out into the crisp September air, Miss Marple adjusted her scarf and set off towards the high street, her step light but purposeful. The tea shop, with its secrets and its scones, awaited. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The high street of St. Mary Mead, usually a picture of bucolic calm, with its thatched cottages and neatly trimmed hedges, was this morning a hive of agitation. A small crowd had gathered outside Mrs. Henshaw's tea shop, their whispers forming a low hum that carried on the autumn breeze. Miss Jane Marple, her black lace mittens tucked neatly into her handbag, approached with her characteristic unhurried step, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The constable stationed at the door, the curious faces of villagers peering through the chintz-curtained windows, and the faint scent of lavender polish mingling with something acrid, almost chemical, that hung in the air. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, the proprietress, had sent a note to Danemead not half an hour earlier, imploring Miss Marple to come at once. "You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple," the note had read, in Clara's hurried, looping script. "I'm at my wit's end, and the police are no help at all." Miss Marple, ever discreet, had agreed to visit, though she suspected her presence would irk Inspector Slack, whose brisk efficiency was matched only by his disdain for amateur sleuths. As she reached the tea shop's entrance, Constable Palk, a ruddy-faced young man with a habit of tugging at his collar, stepped forward. "Morning, Miss Marple. Mrs. Henshaw said you'd be coming, but the inspector's inside, and he's not keen on visitors." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost deferential. "Of course, Constable, I shan't interfere. I only wish to offer Mrs. Henshaw a little comfort in this distressing time. Perhaps you might let her know I'm here." Polk hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into the shop. Moments later, Mrs. Henshaw emerged, her face pale beneath her neatly pinned hair, her apron twisted as though she'd been wringing it in her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming. It's simply awful. Lawrence Redding dead, right here in my shop. They're saying poison and I can't think how it happened. My tea shop of all places." Miss Marple patted her arm soothingly. There, my dear. Let us go inside and you can tell me everything. A clear head is what's needed now." They stepped into the tea shop, where the air was heavy with the scent of scones and that peculiar, sharp undertone Miss Marple had noticed outside. The room was small but charming, its oak tables arranged in neat rows, each adorned with a crisp white cloth and a tiny vase of late-blooming roses. The table by the window where Lawrence Redding had met his end was cordoned off with a length of twine, an incongruous barrier in such a homely setting. The scene was untouched: a plate with a half-eaten scone, a teacup lying on its side, its contents staining the cloth a murky brown, and a sugar bowl, its lid askew, with several cubes scattered across the table. Inspector Slack stood nearby, barking orders at a young sergeant who was dusting the table for fingerprints. He was a lean man, all angles and impatience, with a moustache that seemed to bristle with his mood. Spotting Miss Marple, he frowned. "Miss Marple, this is a police matter, you know. No need for village busybodies to muddy the waters." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, undeterred. "Oh, Inspector, I wouldn't dream of interfering. I'm merely here to support poor Mrs. Henshaw. A death in one's establishment is such a shock, don't you think?" Slack grunted, clearly unconvinced, but turned back to his sergeant. "Get those prints to the lab, and don't miss the sugar bowl. If there's poison, that's where it'll be." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sugar cubes, glinting in the morning light. "Sugar," she murmured, almost to herself. "How very interesting." She recalled a conversation at the vicarage, where Lawrence Redding had declined sugar in his tea, citing a dislike for sweetness. Yet here were the cubes, scattered as though he'd reached for them in haste. She filed the observation away, her mind already turning over possibilities. Mrs. Henshaw, hovering anxiously, began to recount the morning's events. "It was just after 8, Miss Marple. We'd only been open an hour. Mr. Redding came in, same as always, and took his usual table. He ordered tea and a scone, nothing out of the ordinary. I served him myself, and he seemed, well, a bit distracted perhaps, but not unwell. Then Miss Price came in, and Mr. Corey, and that woman in the grey coat. I didn't know her. She's not from the village. She sat in the corner reading a newspaper, but she left before it happened." Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. "And when did you realise something was wrong?" "It was Sally, my girl who helps in the kitchen. She went to clear Mr. Redding's table and saw him slumped over, his face all grey. She screamed and I ran over and, oh, it was dreadful. His hands were clenched and the tea was spilled everywhere. I sent for Dr. Haydock at once and he said it looked like poison. Poison in my tea shop." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the table again, noting the precise arrangement of the scattered sugar cubes. "Who else was in the shop, Mrs. Henshaw? Anyone who might have approached Mr. Redding's table?" Mrs. Henshaw frowned, thinking. "Well, Miss Price was at the next table reading her letters. She always does that, you know. Likes to make a show of being busy. Mr. Corey was by the counter, arguing with Sally about the price of the scones. He's always grumbling about something. And the woman in the grey coat, I didn't see her near Mr. Redding, but she was so quiet. I hardly noticed her at all." Miss Marple made a mental note of the grey-coated woman. Strangers in St. Mary Mead were rare, and those who went unnoticed were rarer still. "And the staff, my dear? Who was in the kitchen?" "Just Sally and me. My nephew, Tom, comes in later to help with deliveries, but he wasn't here this morning." "Oh, Miss Marple, do you think someone could have tampered with the tea? Or the scone? I check everything myself, but..." Miss Marple patted her hand again. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, Mrs. Henshaw. Tell me, did Mr. Redding have any visitors while he was here? Anyone who spoke to him?" Mrs. Henshaw shook her head. "Not that I saw. He kept to himself mostly. Though, now I think of it, he did glance at the woman in the grey coat once or twice. I thought it was odd, but then he was always a bit jumpy." Inspector Slack, who had been listening despite himself, interjected. "Enough of this chatter. We'll have the lab results by tomorrow, and I'll wager it's something simple. Spoiled cream, or a mix-up in the kitchen. No need to spin tales of murder, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Of course, Inspector. I'm sure your methods will uncover the truth. Though, if I may, might I take a closer look at the table? Purely for my own curiosity, you understand." Slack rolled his eyes but waved a hand. "Fine, but don't touch anything. And don't go spreading wild ideas about the village." Miss Marple approached the cordoned-off table, her movements slow and deliberate. She bent slightly, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a jeweller examining a gem. The scone was ordinary, its crumbs scattered in a way that suggested Redding had taken only a bite or two. The teacup, overturned, had left a stain that spread unevenly, as though it had been knocked over in a moment of sudden distress. But it was the sugar bowl that held her attention. The cubes were not uniform. Some were pristine, others slightly crushed, as though handled roughly. She leaned closer, careful not to disturb the scene, and noticed a faint powdery residue on the tablecloth near the bowl, almost invisible against the white fabric. "Curious," she said softly, straightening up. "Very curious indeed." Mrs. Henshaw, hovering nearby, wrung her hands again. "What is it, Miss Marple? Do you see something?" "Oh, nothing of importance," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. "Just the way things are arranged, you know. It's always so telling, the little details." She stepped back, allowing the sergeant to resume his work, but her mind was already piecing together fragments of the morning's events. Lawrence Redding, a man with no apparent enemies in St. Mary Mead, had died in a public place, surrounded by villagers and a stranger. Poison, Dr. Haydock had said, and poison was a deliberate act, requiring both opportunity and intent. The sugar cubes, she thought, were the key, but who had placed them there, and why? As she lingered, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small photograph hanging on the tea shop's wall, half hidden behind a vase of roses. It showed a younger Clara Henshaw standing beside a man with a striking resemblance to Lawrence Redding. Same sharp jawline, same guarded expression. She made a mental note to ask about it later, for Clara's nervous demeanour suggested more than just shock at the morning's events. Inspector Slack, growing impatient, ushered them toward the door. "That's enough for now, ladies. We've got work to do. Mrs. Henshaw, we'll need a list of everyone who was in the shop this morning, and don't leave anyone out." Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Of course, Inspector. I'll do anything to help." Miss Marple, sensing her cue to leave, offered a final word of comfort. "Try not to worry, my dear. The truth has a way of coming to light, even in the most unexpected places." As she stepped back into the high street, the crowd parted to let her pass, their whispers following her like a shadow. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were elsewhere. She considered the players in this little drama. Miss Lavinia Price, whose sharp tongue and love of gossip masked a keen observer. Mr. Giles Corey, whose temper was as well known as his disputes over land. And the mysterious woman in the grey coat, who had slipped away before the tragedy was discovered. And then there was Clara Henshaw herself, whose connection to Redding, however distant, could not be ignored. Miss Marple paused at the corner, glancing back at the tea shop. The scene of the crime, she knew, held more secrets than Inspector Slack's fingerprint powder would reveal. Poison was a personal weapon, chosen with care, and its presence in a sugar bowl suggested a mind both cunning and precise. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Eldridge, who had once poisoned her husband's tea with arsenic, convinced he was unfaithful. The motive had been clear, but the method had been sloppy, easily traced. This, however, was different. This was calculated, and Miss Marple suspected the answer lay not in the tea shop's kitchen, but in Lawrence Redding's past. As she made her way home, her step as light as ever, Miss Marple's mind buzzed with possibilities. She would need to speak to Miss Price, whose post office was a hub of village secrets, and perhaps Mr. Corey, whose temper might betray more than he intended. And the woman in the grey coat, her presence was too convenient, too deliberate, to be a mere coincidence. Back at Danemead, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, picking up her knitting once more. The needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to her thoughts. "Poison," she murmured, her eyes gleaming with quiet determination. And sugar cubes, of all things. How very like human nature to hide the deadly in the mundane. She reached for her notebook, jotting down the morning's observations, the scattered sugar, the overturned teacup, the photograph on the wall. Somewhere in these details, she knew, lay the thread that would unravel the mystery of Lawrence Redding's death. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and her unerring instinct for the truth, was determined to find it. Chapter 3. The Village Whispers. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green where children played and sparrows flitted among the elms. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the Women's Institute meeting in the parish hall, listened with half an ear to Mrs. Price Ridley's impassioned speech about the deplorable state of the churchyard's rose beds. Her fingers moved deftly with her knitting, the pale pink wool forming neat rows, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the morning's events at the tea shop. The hall, with its faded bunting and smell of polished wood, buzzed with the undercurrent of gossip, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the pulse of village life, let the whispers guide her thoughts. The news of Lawrence Redding's death had spread like wildfire, and the Women's Institute was the perfect crucible for speculation. Mrs. Bantry, seated beside Miss Marple, leaned close, her eyes bright with excitement. "Jane, it's positively thrilling in a dreadful way. Poison! In Clara's tea shop. Who'd have thought St. Mary Mead could produce such a scandal?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Thrilling is one word for it, Dolly, but I find it rather sad. A man dead, and for what? We mustn't let the excitement cloud our judgment." Mrs. Bantry waved a hand. "Oh, you're always so sensible, Jane. But you must admit it's intriguing. I heard from Mrs. Weatherby that Redding was no saint in his solicitor days. Something about a shady deal in London, years ago. Do you think it's connected?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind seized on the tidbit. "People do carry their pasts with them, Dolly, even to quiet places like St. Mary Mead. It's worth considering." As Mrs. Price Ridley concluded her tirade and moved on to the matter of the upcoming fete, the conversation among the women turned inevitably to the tea shop tragedy. Miss Lavinia Price, the postmistress, her thin lips pursed, spoke up from her seat near the tea urn. "I always said Mr. Redding was a man with a past. I saw him at the tea shop yesterday, you know, looking positively furtive. And that woman in the grey coat, she was there too, sitting in the corner, watching him like a hawk." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a fraction of a second. "The woman in the grey coat," she said mildly. "How interesting. Did you happen to notice anything particular about her, Miss Price?" Miss Price, flattered by the attention, straightened her spine. "Well, she wasn't from the village, that's certain. Her coat was good quality, but out of fashion. Last season's style, I'd say. She kept her hat pulled low, and she didn't speak to anyone, just sat there with her newspaper. I thought it odd, the way she kept glancing at Mr. Redding, almost as if she knew him." Mrs. Henshaw, who had joined the meeting despite her distress, fidgeted with her handkerchief. "I didn't think much of her at the time," she said, her voice trembling. "She ordered tea and a biscuit, paid in cash, and left before the incident. I wish I'd paid more attention." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "You've had a great shock, my dear. It's natural to miss things in the bustle of a busy morning. But tell me, did Mr. Redding seem himself when you served him?" Mrs. Henshaw hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Now you mention it, he was a bit off. He kept looking out the window, as if expecting someone, and he asked me if I'd seen anyone lingering near the shop the day before. I thought he meant the delivery boy, but perhaps—" She trailed off, her eyes widening. "Oh, Miss Marple, do you think he knew someone was after him?" Before Miss Marple could respond, Mr. Giles Corey, who had entered the hall to deliver a message about the Fates vegetable competition, overheard and snorted. "Redding was a meddler, that's what he was, always poking his nose into other people's business. He had the nerve to question my claim to the meadow by the brook, said it wasn't properly deeded. As if he had any right." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, though her voice remained gentle. "A land dispute, Mr. Corey. That must have been most vexing. Vexing? Corey's face reddened. It's my land, fair and square, and I'll not have some city solicitor stirring up trouble. If you ask me, he got what was coming to him. A hush fell over the room, broken only by Mrs. Price Ridley's indignant gasp. Mr. Corey, that's a terrible thing to say. Corey shrugged, unrepentant, and stomped out, leaving the women to exchange shocked glances. Miss Marple, however, noted the farmer's clenched fists and the way his eyes had darted toward Mrs. Henshaw, as though seeking her reaction. She filed it away, along with Miss Price's observation of the grey-coated woman and Mrs. Henshaw's mention of Redding's unease. As the meeting drew to a close, Miss Marple lingered, helping to stack chairs while listening to the ebb and flow of conversation. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for a mystery, pressed her for thoughts. Come now, Jane, you've got that look in your eye. What are you thinking? Was it the woman in the grey coat? Or do you suspect Corey with his temper? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I'm thinking, Dolly, that people are rarely what they seem. Mr. Redding, for instance, chose St. Mary Mead for a reason, and I doubt it was merely the charm of our roses. As for the woman in the grey coat, she interests me very much. A stranger who watches but does not speak is often hiding something. Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled. You're going to solve this, aren't you? Just like that business with the vicar's niece last year. Miss Marple's smile widened, but she said nothing, her mind already turning to the next steps. She needed to know more about Lawrence Redding's past, and the vicarage, where he had dined only a week ago, might hold clues. The vicar, Leonard Clement, was a kind man but not always observant, though his wife, Griselda, had a knack for noticing the odd detail. And then there was the photograph in the tea shop, the one of Clara Henshaw and the man who looked so like Redding. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple had learned to distrust coincidences. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, the village seemed to close in around her, its familiar cottages and quiet lanes hiding secrets as surely as any city. She passed Rose Cottage where Redding had lived, its windows dark and its garden gate slightly ajar. On impulse, she paused, noting a faint scuff mark in the dirt near the gate, as though someone had stood there recently, perhaps watching the house. She made a mental note to mention it to Constable Polk, though she suspected he would dismiss it as irrelevant. Back at Dane Mead, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as Cherry brought her a cup of tea. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. She opened her small notebook, its pages filled with neat, spidery handwriting, and began to jot down the day's observations. Miss Price's sharp eyes, Corey's temper, the grey-coated woman's furtive glances, and Redding's own unease. She thought of her niece Mabel, who had once fallen in love with a man who turned out to be a swindler. Mabel's trust had blinded her to his faults, just as Clara Henshaw's grief might blind her to something closer to home. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking steadily. It's always the same, whether in a tea shop or a grand house. Someone wanted Mr. Redding dead, and they chose a very public way to do it. Now, why was that? She sipped her tea, her mind tracing patterns as intricate as her knitting. The woman in the grey coat was a puzzle, but so too was Redding's past. A solicitor, retired, with a history that Mrs. Weatherby called shady. Miss Marple knew that solicitors, like doctors, often held secrets that could ruin lives. Wills altered, trusts betrayed, promises broken. Had Redding crossed someone years ago? Someone who had followed him to St. Mary Mead? Or was the answer closer, in the village itself, hidden in the grudges and glances of its residents? As the fire crackled in the grate, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vicarage. She would call on Griselda tomorrow, under the pretense of discussing the fate. Griselda's chatter, often dismissed as frivolous, had a way of revealing truths others overlooked. And perhaps the vicar himself might recall something Redding had said, some hint of the old debts that had troubled him. For now, Miss Marple closed her notebook and set her knitting aside. The village whispers had given her much to ponder, and she knew that somewhere in their tangled threads lay the truth about Lawrence Redding's death. She rose, her step light despite the late hour, and glanced out her window at the darkened high street. St. Mary Mead slept, but its secrets did not, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would see them brought to light. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Clue. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the vicarage. Her black brogues crunched lightly on the gravel path, and her gloved hand clutched a small basket of apples from her garden, a pretext for her visit, though her true purpose was to glean what she could from the vicar and his wife. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, and the church bells tolled softly, a reminder of the passing hours in a village now shadowed by death. Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on Lawrence Redding, whose sudden demise in the tea shop had stirred St. Mary Mead's tranquil surface, like a stone dropped in a still pond. The word poison, whispered by Dr. Haydock and confirmed by the coroner's preliminary report, had set her mind racing. Poison was no accident. It required intent, planning, and a certain intimacy with the victim's habits. As she approached the vicarage gate, she recalled the scattered sugar cubes on Redding's table, their presence a silent accusation against someone who knew more than they let on. Griselda Clement, the vicar's young wife, greeted her at the door with her usual exuberance. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. Come in, come in. Leonard's in his study, wrestling with next Sunday's sermon, but I'm sure he'll be glad of the interruption. Have you heard about poor Mr. Redding? It's all anyone can talk about." Miss Marple smiled, handing over the basket of apples. "Indeed, Griselda, it's a terrible business. I thought I might call to see how you're both bearing up. Mr. Redding dined here recently, did he not?" Griselda led her into the sitting room, where a fire crackled cheerfully despite the sombre mood. "Oh yes, last Tuesday. He was quiet, as usual, but Leonard said he seemed troubled. Something about an old case from his solicitor days. I didn't catch much of it. I was busy with the pudding, but Leonard might remember more." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her eyes taking in the room's familiar clutter. Books piled haphazardly, a vase of wilting dahlias, and Griselda's latest attempt at embroidery, abandoned on a side table. "An old case," she said thoughtfully. "How intriguing. I wonder if the vicar might spare a moment to tell me about it." Griselda darted off to fetch her husband, and Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the window, where the vicarage garden stretched toward the churchyard. She thought of the scuff mark near Redding's cottage gate, a small detail that nagged at her. Someone had been watching, perhaps waiting, and the grey-coated woman mentioned by Miss Price loomed large in her mind. The Reverend Leonard Clement entered, his spectacles slightly askew, and his expression one of mild distraction. "Miss Marple, a pleasure as always. Griselda says you're here about poor Redding. A shocking affair, truly shocking." "Indeed, Vicar," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "I understand Mr. Redding dined with you last week. Did he mention anything that struck you as unusual? A worry, perhaps, or a hint of trouble?" Leonard frowned, settling into a chair. "Now you mention it, he did seem preoccupied. Over dinner, he spoke briefly of a case from his time in London, a will, I believe, that caused some controversy. He said it had come back to haunt him, though he didn't elaborate. I thought he meant it figuratively, but now, well, I wonder." Miss Marple's needles, which she had produced from her bag, clicked softly. "A will, you say? How very suggestive. Did he mention any names? Or perhaps a place?" Leonard shook his head. "No names, I'm afraid. He was rather vague, and Griselda changed the subject to the parish fete, but I got the impression it was something he regretted, something that weighed on him. Griselda, re-entering with a tea tray, chimed in. I did notice him staring out the window a lot that night, as if he expected someone to appear. And once, when a car backfired in the lane, he nearly dropped his glass. I thought he was just nervous, but perhaps it was more than that. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving these threads into the tapestry of the case. A contested will, a man haunted by his past, and a death by poison in a public place. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the full picture remained elusive. She thanked the Clements and promised to return for the fete, then made her way back to the high street, her thoughts turning to the tea shop. Mrs. Henshaw had reopened the shop that morning, determined to carry on despite the tragedy. Miss Marple found her behind the counter, her face drawn but resolute as she served tea to a sparse handful of customers. The table by the window was empty, its cloth replaced, though the air still seemed to carry the weight of what had happened there. "Miss Marple!" Mrs. Henshaw exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm so glad you've come. It's been quiet today. People are afraid, I think. And Inspector Slack keeps asking questions, as if I had anything to do with it." Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. "It's only his way, my dear. The police must be thorough. I wonder, though, if I might have a look at the kitchen, just to set my mind at ease about how things are managed here." Mrs. Henshaw hesitated, then nodded, leading her through a curtained doorway to the small kitchen. It was a tidy space, with shelves of neatly labelled tins and a gleaming stove. The sugar was kept in a large metal tin near the sink, its lid loose and easily accessible. Miss Marple noted the proximity to the back door, which opened onto a narrow alley. "Do you lock this door when the shop is busy?" she asked. Mrs. Henshaw flushed. "Not always, I'm afraid. When we're rushed, Sally or I might step out to take deliveries, and we leave it open for Tom. Anyone could slip in, I suppose." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the sugar tin. "And the sugar, is it always kept here?" "Yes, we refill the bowls each morning. I checked it myself the day before it happened. It seemed perfectly normal." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock had said, was quick and deadly, and its presence in the sugar cubes suggested a deliberate act. But how had it been introduced, and by whom? The open back door was a possibility, but it required opportunity and knowledge of the shop's routine. She thanked Mrs. Henshaw and returned to the main room, where her gaze once again fell on the photograph she had noticed the previous day. Clara Henshaw, younger, standing beside a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Lawrence Redding. "Mrs. Henshaw," she said gently, "this photograph, who is the gentleman with you?" Mrs. Henshaw's hand flew to her throat, and she hesitated before answering. "That's my late brother George. He and Lawrence were friends years ago, when they both worked in London. George was a clerk in Lawrence's firm. It's just an old memory, nothing more." Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic, but her mind noted the tremor in Clara's voice. "How sad that you lost your brother. Was it recent?" "No, it was nearly 20 years ago. A terrible accident. He fell from a train. Lawrence was kind to me afterward, sent a letter of condolence. I hadn't seen him in years until he moved here." Miss Marple nodded, filing away this new piece of the puzzle. A brother, a friend, a shared past in London, and now a death in Clara's tea shop. She thought of her old friend Mrs. Hartley, whose brother had died in a similar accident, only for it to be revealed as something far darker. The past, Miss Marple knew, had a way of reaching into the present. As she left the tea shop, she encountered Dr. Haydock, who was just arriving with news from the coroner. "Miss Marple," he said, his face grim, "I thought you'd want to know. It's definitely cyanide, and it was in the sugar cubes. The tea was clean, and so was the scone. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Cyanide in the sugar. How precise. It suggests someone who knew Mr. Redding's habits, or could ensure he took the sugar that morning. Haydock nodded. That's what I thought. Slack's convinced it's someone local, but I'm not so sure. Redding wasn't here long enough to make enemies, was he? Enemies, Miss Marple said softly, can follow one anywhere. Thank you, Doctor. You've been most helpful. As she walked home, the mist had lifted, revealing the village in sharp clarity. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the grey-coated woman, whose presence seemed to hover over the case like a spectre. Miss Price had seen her watching Redding, and Mrs. Henshaw had noted his unease. Was she a stranger, or someone from Redding's past, cloaked in anonymity? And what of Clara's brother George, whose death seemed to cast a shadow over the tea shop? Back at Danemead, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as she pondered the poisoned clue. The sugar cubes were the key, she was certain, but their significance lay not just in the cyanide, but in what they revealed about the killer's mind. Someone had known Redding would take sugar that morning, despite his usual preference for plain tea. Someone had access to the tea shop's supplies, or the cunning to introduce the poison unnoticed. And someone, perhaps, had a motive rooted in a London past that Redding could not escape. She opened her notebook, adding new entries. The vicar's mention of a contested will, Griselda's observation of Redding's nervousness, Clara's brother and his accident, and the ever-elusive woman in the grey coat. As the firelight flickered, Miss Marple's needles clicked in rhythm with her thoughts. A poisoned clue, she murmured, and a poisoned heart. The two are never far apart. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Danemead, casting intricate patterns on the polished floor, as Miss Jane Marple sat at her writing desk, her small notebook open before her. The events at the tea shop had stirred St. Mary Mead into a state of restless curiosity, and Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for untangling human motives, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. Her knitting lay idle for once, replaced by a pen that scratched softly as she jotted down the threads of the case. Lawrence Redding's death by cyanide, the tampered sugar cubes, the grey-coated woman, and now the tantalising hint of a London past involving Clara Henshaw's brother, George. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a letter, delivered by young Tommy Pierce, who lingered at the door with a hopeful grin, no doubt expecting a penny for his trouble. She obliged, then slit open the envelope, recognising the precise handwriting of Sir Henry Clithering, her old friend from Scotland Yard. His note was brief, but illuminating, responding to her discreet inquiry about Lawrence Redding's solicitor days. "My dear Jane," it began, "your nose for trouble never fails. Redding was indeed involved in a scandal some 20 years ago, a contested will case involving the Grayson family. A young woman, Eleanor Grayson, was disinherited after her father's death, the estate passing to a distant cousin. Redding, as the solicitor, was accused of mishandling the will, though no charges were ever brought. The matter caused quite a stir in legal circles. Eleanor Grayson vanished from London shortly after, and there's no record of her since. As for George Henshaw, he was a clerk in Redding's firm and died in a train accident around the same time. No foul play was suspected, but the timing is curious. I trust you'll make something of this. Yours, Henry." Miss Marple folded the letter, her eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. Eleanor Grayson. The name resonated, a piece of the puzzle slotting into place. Could she be the woman in the grey coat, returned after 2 decades to settle an old score? And George Henshaw's death, described as an accident, yet so conveniently timed. Miss Marple knew from experience that accidents were often anything but, especially when they followed a scandal. She thought of her cousin's gardener, who had accidentally fallen into a pond after a dispute over wages, only for it to emerge that a rival had loosened the stones by the water's edge. Determined to pursue this lead, Miss Marple decided to visit Miss Lavinia Price at the post office, where the village's secrets were sorted as surely as the mail. The post office was a cramped, cheerful place, its counter cluttered with stamps and parcels, and Miss Price, with her sharp nose and sharper tongue, presided over it like a hawk. As Miss Marple entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Miss Price looked up from sorting letters. "Miss Marple, I suppose you're here about that dreadful business at the tea shop. I told Clara she ought to be more careful who she lets in. Strangers, indeed." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "You're quite right, Miss Price. Strangers do stand out in St. Mary Mead. I believe you mentioned a woman in a grey coat at the tea shop. Have you seen her since?" Miss Price's eyes narrowed, relishing the chance to share her observations. "As a matter of fact, I have. Last evening near dusk, I saw her by the church, standing just outside Mr. Redding's cottage. She was looking at the windows, as if she meant to go in, but thought better of it. I couldn't see her face, hat pulled low, you know, but I'd swear it was the same woman. There's something sly about her. Mark my words." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "How very observant of you. Did she do anything else? Speak to anyone, perhaps?" "Not that I saw. She just stood there, then walked off toward the station. I thought of telling Constable Polk, but he's so busy with Inspector Slack's orders. I didn't want to bother him." "You did quite right to tell me," Miss Marple said, her tone encouraging. "It's these little details that help us understand what happened to poor Mr. Redding. You didn't happen to overhear anything he said at the tea shop, did you? About his past, perhaps?" Miss Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, I shouldn't say, but the day before he died, I heard him talking to Mrs. Henshaw. He asked if she'd had any letters from London lately, and he sounded anxious. Clara said no, but she looked uncomfortable, as if she didn't want to talk about it. And then there was that argument with Mr. Corey, right in the shop. Redding said something about the meadow being wrongly claimed, and Corey went red as beat and stormed out." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alight with possibilities. Redding's inquiry about letters suggested he was expecting, or fearing, contact from his past, and his dispute with Giles Corey, while seemingly unrelated, hinted at a man who stirred trouble wherever he went. She thanked Miss Price and purchased a few stamps, then stepped back into the high street, her thoughts turning to Clara Henshaw. Rather than return to the tea shop, Miss Marple decided to call on Mrs. Bantry, whose cousinly connection to Clara might yield further insights. She found Mrs. Bantry in her drawing room at Gossington Hall, surrounded by gardening catalogues and a half-finished letter to her florist. "Jane!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, tossing aside her pen. "You're just the person I wanted to see. Clara's in a state, says she can't sleep for worrying about the tea shop. Do you think someone's trying to ruin her?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It's possible, Dolly, but I suspect Mr. Redding's death was more personal than that. Tell me, what do you know of Clara's brother George? She mentioned he was a friend of Redding's, but I sense there's more to the story." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "George? Oh, Clara doesn't talk about him much. He died years ago before she married Mr. Henshaw. She always said it was a terrible accident, but I remember her being awfully upset at the time. She blamed herself, I think, for not keeping in touch with him. He worked for Redding in London, you know, as a clerk. Clara said he was clever, but got mixed up with some bad business. I never got the details. She clams up whenever I ask." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. "And did Clara ever mention a woman named Eleanor Grayson?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking. "Grayson? No, I don't think so. But Clara did say once that Redding had enemies in London, people who felt cheated by his work. She didn't like to talk about it, said it brought back bad memories of George." Miss Marple's mind turned to the photograph in the tea shop, the image of a younger Clara with a man who resembled Redding. George's death, Redding's scandal, and now a mysterious woman watching from the shadows. It was a tapestry of connections, woven with threads of resentment and loss. She thought of her old friend, Miss Carter, whose brother had been ruined by a dishonest lawyer, and how the pain of that betrayal had lingered for years, surfacing in unexpected ways. As she took her leave of Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple decided to consult her scrapbooks, a collection of clippings and notes she kept in a cupboard at Danemead. Back home, she spread them across her dining table, their yellowed pages filled with snippets of village life and beyond. After some searching, she found a brief article from a London paper, dated 20 years prior, about the Grayson will case. It described Eleanor Grayson's claim that her father's will had been altered, with Lawrence Redding named as the solicitor, who oversaw the estate's transfer to a cousin, Mr. Arthur Pelham. The article hinted at irregularities, but noted that the case was dropped for lack of evidence. A small obituary, tucked in a later scrapbook, confirmed George Henshaw's death in a train accident shortly after, with no mention of foul play. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes narrowing. Eleanor Grayson, disinherited and humiliated, had disappeared from London. George Henshaw, Redding's clerk, had died in an accident that now seemed suspiciously convenient. And Redding himself, after years of apparent peace, had chosen to settle in St. Mary Mead, where Clara Henshaw, George's sister, ran her tea shop. The coincidences were piling up, and Miss Marple knew better than to trust them. That evening, as she sat by her fire, she telephoned Sir Henry Clithering again, asking him to check for any recent sightings of Eleanor Grayson or records of her whereabouts. "I have a feeling, Henry," she said, her voice soft but firm, "that our grey-coated woman may be more than a stranger passing through." Sir Henry chuckled. "You're on to something, Jane, I can tell. I'll see what I can dig up, but be careful. Poisoners aren't to be trifled with." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, I'm always careful, Henry, but I do find that a little curiosity goes a long way." As she hung up, her thoughts returned to the tea shop, the sugar cubes, and the woman in the grey coat. Eleanor Grayson, if it was indeed her, had chosen a public place to strike, a bold move that suggested both confidence and a desire to be seen. But why? To send a message, perhaps, or to ensure Redding knew who had ended his life? And what of Clara Henshaw, whose grief for her brother seemed to carry a weight of guilt? Miss Marple's mind flickered to her neighbour Mrs. Trent, who had once harboured a secret resentment against a friend, only for it to surface years later in a bitter act of betrayal. She opened her notebook, adding new entries: Eleanor Grayson's disappearance, George Henshaw's accident, Redding's anxious questions about letters, and the grey-coated woman's vigil outside his cottage. The shadows of the past were lengthening, and Miss Marple knew that somewhere in their depths lay the motive for a murder. As the fire crackled and the village settled into sleep, she felt a quiet certainty that the truth was close, waiting to be uncovered by her patient, unassuming hand. Chapter 6. The trap is set. The soft glow of lamplight spilled from the windows of Danemead as Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles idle for once, her mind wholly occupied with the puzzle of Lawrence Redding's death. The village of St. Mary Mead, usually so predictable in its rhythms, had been unsettled by the poison in the tea shop, and Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, sensed that the truth was tantalizingly close. The threads of the case: Eleanor Grayson's lost inheritance, George Henshaw's untimely death, the grey-coated woman's furtive presence, and Clara Henshaw's nervous reticence, were weaving together, but the pattern remained incomplete. A bold move was needed to draw the culprit into the open. Miss Marple's plan was simple, yet daring. Inspired by a memory of her friend Mrs. Langley, who had once flushed out a thief by spreading a rumor about a hidden jewel. She would sow a seed of doubt, a whisper that someone had seen more than they let on, and watch who reacted. The grey-coated woman, if indeed she was Eleanor Grayson, was the key, and Miss Marple suspected she was still in St. Mary Mead, lurking in the shadows of the village's quiet lanes. The next morning, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall, knowing her friend's penchant for gossip would serve the purpose admirably. Over tea in the airy drawing-room with its view of the rose garden, Miss Marple outlined her scheme. "Dolly," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial, "I need your help with a little experiment. Would you be so kind as to mention, in passing, that a witness saw someone tampering with the sugar at the tea shop just before Mr. Redding's death, perhaps at the butcher's or the post office, where it's sure to spread?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with delight. "Oh, Jane, you're positively wicked. A witness, you say? Who are we implicating?" "No one specific," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene. "Just a vague hint, enough to make someone nervous. The guilty, you see, are often the first to betray themselves when they think they're being watched." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. "I'll do it at once. I'm seeing Mrs. Weatherby this afternoon, and you know how she talks. By evening, the whole village will be buzzing." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. "Be discreet, Dolly, but not too discreet. We want the rumour to reach the right ears." As Mrs. Bantry set off on her mission, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage to consult with Griselda Clement, whose youthful exuberance often masked a sharp eye for detail. The vicarage was in its usual state of cheerful disarray, with Griselda's knitting tangled on a chair and a plate of half-eaten biscuits on the table. "Miss Marple!" Griselda exclaimed, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "You're here about Mr. Redding, aren't you? Leonard says you're bound to solve it before that awful Inspector Slack." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I'm only trying to help, Griselda. Tell me, have you noticed anyone unusual about the village lately? A stranger, perhaps? Or someone acting out of character?" Griselda tilted her head, thinking. "Well, there was that woman I saw near the church 2 nights ago. She was standing by the lich gate, just staring at Rose Cottage. I thought she was lost, but when I called out, she hurried off toward the station. She had a grey coat and a hat pulled low, like Miss Price described." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "How very interesting. And did you see where she went after that?" "No, she was too quick. But it gave me the shivers, the way she moved, like she didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple made a mental note, her suspicions about the grey-coated woman solidifying. If she was Eleanor Grayson, her presence near Redding's cottage suggested a purpose beyond mere observation. Was she planning her next move, or ensuring her work was done? Miss Marple thanked Griselda and left, her mind turning to the tea shop's layout and the ease with which someone could slip in through the back door. By afternoon, Mrs. Bantry's rumour had taken root. Miss Marple, lingering near the post office under the pretence of mailing a letter, overheard Mrs. Weatherby whispering to the baker's wife about a witness who had seen something suspicious at the tea shop. The news spread swiftly, and by evening the village was alive with speculation. Miss Marple, returning home, noted the nervous glances of passers-by and the hushed conversations at the Blue Boar. Her trap was set. Now she needed to watch. That evening she enlisted Cherry, her maid, whose youthful energy and sharp ears made her an ideal ally. "Cherry," Miss Marple said, as they sat in the kitchen with a pot of tea, "I need you to keep an eye on the tea shop tonight. Not inside, mind you, just from the lane. If anyone approaches the back door, note what they do, but don't let yourself be seen." Cherry's eyes widened. "You think the murderer's coming back, miss, to cover their tracks?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Something like that, Cherry. People often return to the scene of their mistakes, especially when they fear they've been noticed." As night fell, Miss Marple positioned herself at her drawing-room window, a vantage point that offered a clear view of the high street. The village was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a motor car. She kept her knitting close, more for comfort than necessity, her eyes fixed on the darkened silhouette of the tea shop. The rumour, she knew, would unsettle the guilty, and a guilty conscience was a powerful spur to action. At 11:30, Cherry slipped back into Danemead, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, you were right. I saw someone, a woman, I'm sure, in a grey coat. She came down the alley behind the tea shop and tried the back door. It was locked, but she fiddled with it, like she was trying to pick it. Then she looked around, all nervous-like, and went inside. I ran to fetch Constable Polk, and he's there now." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her expression calm but triumphant. "Well done, Cherry. You've been most helpful. Let us hope Constable Polk catches our visitor before she does any mischief." Within the hour, Constable Polk knocked at Danemead's door, his face a mix of pride and exasperation. "Miss Marple, we've got her. The woman in the grey coat. Caught her red-handed, trying to take the sugar tin from the tea shop's kitchen. She's at the station now, and Inspector Slack wants a word with you." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Constable. I'll come at once. It's always so satisfying when things fall into place, don't you think?" At the small police station, a converted cottage at the edge of the village, Miss Marple found Inspector Slack pacing irritably. The woman in the grey coat sat in a chair, her hat removed to reveal a lined face and greying hair, her eyes hard with defiance. Miss Marple studied her, noting the elegance of her posture despite the worn coat and the faint tremor in her hands, betraying nerves beneath her composure. "Miss Marple," Slack said, his tone grudging, "this is Miss Eleanor Grayson. She claims she was only in the tea shop to retrieve a lost glove, but we found her with the sugar tin in her hands. Care to explain why you thought she'd be there tonight?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Oh, Inspector, it was merely a guess, based on human nature. When people hear they've been seen, they often act to cover their tracks. I thought our mysterious visitor might return to ensure no evidence remained." Eleanor Grayson's head snapped up, her voice sharp. "I wasn't covering anything. I told you, I lost my glove, and I thought it might be in the kitchen. I've done nothing wrong." Miss Marple's eyes met hers, calm and penetrating. "A glove, Miss Grayson. How unfortunate to lose it. But I wonder if you might tell us why you were watching Mr. Redding's cottage 2 nights ago, or why you asked Mrs. Henshaw such curious questions about him the day before his death." Eleanor's face paled, but she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Inspector Slack, sensing an opportunity, leaned forward. "You better talk, Miss Grayson. We've got the sugar tin, and we'll test it for cyanide. If it matches, you're in serious trouble." Miss Marple interjected softly. "Perhaps, Inspector, Miss Grayson might find it easier to speak in a less formal setting. A cup of tea at the vicarage, perhaps, with only myself and Mrs. Henshaw present. Sometimes the truth comes more readily in familiar surroundings." Slack scowled but relented, sensing Miss Marple's knack for results. "Fine, but I'm sending Park with you, and no funny business." Miss Marple nodded, her plan unfolding. She suspected Eleanor Grayson held the key to Redding's death, but her motives were tangled in a past that Clara Henshaw shared. A meeting at the vicarage, with Clara present, might loosen the threads of silence. As she left the station, her step light despite the late hour, Miss Marple felt the quiet thrill of the chase. The trap had sprung, but the truth remained just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Chapter 7. The Truth Unraveled. The vicarage parlour, with its faded chintz curtains and lingering scent of lavender wax, felt like a sanctuary of calm amidst the storm of suspicion that had engulfed St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes bright with the quiet intensity of one who senses the end of a puzzle approaching. Across from her sat Eleanor Grayson, her grey coat now draped over a chair, revealing a worn but elegant dress that spoke of better days. Clara Henshaw, summoned from the tea shop, perched nervously on the edge of a sofa, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. Constable Polk stood by the door, his presence a formality, while Griselda Clement hovered with a tea tray, her curiosity barely contained. Miss Marple had orchestrated this meeting with care, knowing that the truth about Lawrence Redding's death lay in the tangled threads of past grievances and present fears. The rumour she had seeded through Mrs. Bantry had flushed Eleanor Grayson out, and now, in the soft light of the vicarage, Miss Marple intended to unravel the final knots of the mystery. "Thank you for coming, Miss Grayson," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm. "And you, Mrs. Henshaw. I know this is distressing, but I believe we are close to understanding what happened to Mr. Redding. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it?" Eleanor Grayson's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the fire. Clara, however, let out a small gasp. "The past? Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know what you mean. I've told you all I know about Lawrence and my brother George." Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her gaze was penetrating. "Have you, my dear? I wonder. Let us start with something simple. Miss Grayson, you were seen at the tea shop the morning Mr. Redding died, and again outside his cottage. You were also caught attempting to remove the sugar tin last night. I think you knew Mr. Redding, perhaps from long ago. Would you care to tell us about it?" Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "I don't see why I should explain myself to you, Miss Marple. I told the inspector it was about a lost glove. I've nothing more to say." Miss Marple nodded, undeterred. "A glove is a small thing to risk so much for, Miss Grayson. But let me tell you what I think. I believe you are Eleanor Grayson, once involved in a bitter dispute over your father's will in London some 20 years ago. Mr. Redding, as the solicitor, oversaw the estate's transfer to a cousin, leaving you with nothing. It was a great injustice, wasn't it? And then, not long after, Mrs. Henshaw's brother George, a clerk in Redding's firm, died in a train accident. A curious coincidence, don't you think?" Clara's face paled, and she clutched her handkerchief tighter. "George's death was an accident. The inquest said so. What does this have to do with Lawrence?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone remained steady. "Accidents, my dear, are sometimes more than they seem. I've seen it before, in my own village and beyond. A young woman I knew, years ago, lost her inheritance in a similar way, and the pain of it festered until it drove her to a desperate act. I think, Miss Grayson, that you blamed Mr. Redding for your loss, and perhaps for something more. Did you know George Henshaw too?" Eleanor's composure cracked, her voice rising. "Know him? Of course I knew him. George was my friend, the only one who stood by me when Redding and his cronies cheated me out of my father's estate. He told me the will was altered, that Redding had manipulated the papers for a bribe from Arthur Pelham. George was going to expose him, but then he died, pushed from that train. I'm sure of it, though I could never prove it. Redding ruined my life, and he took George's too." Clara let out a sob, her hands covering her face. No, it can't be true. George never told me about any of this. He wrote to me, said he was happy in his work. His death was an accident. I've always believed that." Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara's hand. "I'm sure you did, my dear. But grief can blind us to truths we'd rather not see. I think Miss Grayson came to St. Mary Mead because she learned Mr. Redding was here, living quietly after all these years. She watched him, didn't she? At the tea shop, at his cottage. And then, somehow, she found a way to put cyanide in the sugar cubes he used that morning." Eleanor's eyes flashed with defiance. "You've no proof of that?" "I was in the tea shop, yes. But I didn't touch the sugar. I wanted Redding to know I was here, to see the fear in his eyes when he recognized me. But I didn't kill him. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Clara, who was trembling now. Mrs. Henshaw, you served Mr. Redding that morning. You told me he seemed distracted, asking about strangers and letters. Did he mention Miss Grayson to you? Or perhaps ask about your brother? Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He did ask about George, just once, a few days before. He wanted to know if I'd kept any of George's old letters. I thought it was odd, but I told him I'd burned them years ago. I didn't want to talk about George. It hurts too much. Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final threads. I see. And yet, Miss Grayson, you knew Mr. Redding took sugar at the tea shop, didn't you? Even though he preferred his tea plain at home. Someone told you his habits. Perhaps someone who worked there. Eleanor's face hardened, but she remained silent. Miss Marple turned to Clara, her voice gentle but insistent. Clara, my dear, I think you know more than you've said. You were so quick to dismiss Miss Grayson's presence at the tea shop, and yet you noticed her watching Mr. Redding. Did you speak to her? Did she tell you who she was? Clara's hands dropped, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't know her name at first. She came in a few days before, asked about Lawrence, said she was an old friend. I thought she was just curious, but then she mentioned George, said he'd been wronged too. I didn't want to believe her, but she was so convincing. She said Lawrence had cheated people, that he deserved to pay. I told her he took sugar at the shop. I didn't think anything of it. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't know she'd do this. Eleanor stood abruptly, her voice sharp. I didn't do it. Yes, I hated Redding, and yes, I wanted him to suffer, but I didn't poison him. I only wanted to confront him, to make him admit what he'd done to me and George. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind racing. Clara's admission was damning, but Eleanor's denial rang with a note of truth. The cyanide had been precise, placed in the sugar cubes that only Redding would use that morning. Clara, with her access to the kitchen and her knowledge of Redding's habits, had been manipulated. But was there more to her role? Miss Marple thought of her old friend Mrs. Fowler, who had been persuaded to betray a confidence, only to find herself an unwitting accomplice in a greater crime. Constable Polk, Miss Marple said, turning to the young man by the door, I think it would be wise to have Inspector Slack test the sugar tin Miss Grayson tried to take. If it contains cyanide, we'll know more. But I suspect the truth lies in what was said between these two women, and what Clara believed about her brother's death. Polk nodded, stepping out to fetch the inspector. Clara, sobbing now, clutched Miss Marple's hand. I didn't mean any harm, Miss Marple. I only told her about the sugar because she seemed so sure Lawrence was guilty. I thought she just wanted to scare him. Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression kind but resolute. We all make mistakes, my dear, but the truth has a way of coming out, even when we try to hide it. When Inspector Slack arrived, his moustache bristling with impatience, Miss Marple recounted the conversation, her voice calm and precise. Eleanor Grayson, still defiant, admitted to her grudge against Redding, but insisted she had not acted on it. Clara, broken by guilt, confessed to sharing Redding's habits with Eleanor, though she swore she had not known about the cyanide. Slack, grudgingly impressed, ordered Eleanor detained for further questioning and sent the sugar tin for analysis. As he escorted her out, he turned to Miss Marple. You've a knack for this, I'll give you that. But don't think you're running my investigation. Miss Marple's smile was serene. Oh, Inspector, I wouldn't dream of it. I only wish to see justice done. As the vicarage emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts on Clara's tearful confession. Eleanor Grayson's hatred was clear, but the poison required a steadier hand. Someone with access and opportunity. Clara's role, unwitting or not, had been pivotal. But Miss Marple suspected the full truth lay in the interplay of their motives, Eleanor's vengeance, and Clara's buried grief for her brother. The shadows of the past had indeed cast a long net, and Lawrence Redding had been caught in it, his death a final reckoning for sins long buried. Chapter 8. The Village Restored. The late September sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden at Danemead, a cup of tea cooling on the wrought-iron table beside her, her knitting resumed in her lap. The pale pink shawl was nearly complete, its delicate stitches a testament to her patience, much like the quiet persistence that had unravelled the mystery of Lawrence Redding's death. The village, shaken by the events at the tea shop, was slowly settling back into its familiar rhythm, though the echoes of the tragedy lingered in hushed conversations and sidelong glances. Eleanor Grayson had been taken to the county jail, charged with Redding's murder after the sugar tin she attempted to steal was found to contain traces of cyanide, matching the poison that killed him. Her confession, extracted under Inspector Slack's relentless questioning, was both bitter and unrepentant. She admitted to slipping the cyanide into the sugar cubes, guided by Clara Henshaw's unwitting disclosure of Redding's habits. Her motive was rooted in the old wound of her disinheritance, compounded by her belief that Redding had orchestrated George Henshaw's death to silence his accusations of fraud. Though she could not prove the latter, her hatred had festered over 2 decades, leading her to St. Mary Mead when she learned of Redding's presence through a chance encounter with an old legal acquaintance. Clara Henshaw, devastated by her role in the tragedy, had closed the tea shop temporarily and announced her intention to sell it. "I can't bear to stay," she had told Miss Marple tearfully, as they sat in the vicarage parlour after Eleanor's arrest. "Every time I see that table, I think of Lawrence and of George, and how I failed them both." Miss Marple had listened with her usual compassion, though she noted privately that Clara's guilt was as much for her brother's unavenged death as for her part in Redding's. She had recommended a quiet seaside town for Clara's retreat, knowing that time and distance might ease the weight of her memories. Now, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, Mrs. Bantry arrived, her hat slightly askew from her brisk walk across the village. "Jane, you're a marvel," she exclaimed, settling into a chair with a rustle of skirts. "Everyone's talking about how you caught that Grayson woman. Inspector Slack's positively fuming that you got there first, but he can't deny you were right. How did you know she'd go back for the sugar tin?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she set her knitting aside. "Oh, Dolly, it's only human nature. When people think they've been seen, they panic, and panic leads to mistakes. I remembered a case in my youth, a girl who stole from her employer and tried to destroy the evidence when she heard a rumour that someone had spotted her. Eleanor Grayson was clever, but she couldn't resist checking that her tracks were covered." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But what about Clara? Do you think she knew more than she let on? I mean, telling Eleanor about the sugar, that was awfully convenient." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Clara was deceived, Dolly, but not entirely innocent. She suspected Redding had wronged her brother, and when Eleanor spoke of his crimes, it stirred old doubts. I don't believe she knew about the cyanide, but she wanted Redding to face some kind of reckoning. It's a sad thing, how grief can twist one's judgment." Mrs. Bantry sighed, shaking her head. "Poor Clara. And to think it all started with that wretched will in London. Do you suppose Eleanor was right about Redding pushing George off that train?" Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of her teacup. "We'll never know for certain, I'm afraid. The inquest ruled it an accident, and there's no evidence to contradict it. But Eleanor believed it, and that belief drove her to murder. It's a reminder, Dolly, that the past is never truly past. It lingers in the heart, waiting to be stirred." The two women sat in companionable silence, the garden humming with the soft buzz of bees and the distant laughter of children on the green. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to her scrapbooks, where she would add a final note about the tea-shop case, a cautionary tale of vengeance and betrayal. She thought, too, of her old friend Miss Hartnell, who had once harboured a grudge against a neighbour for years, only to find it was based on a misunderstanding. How easily, Miss Marple mused, the heart could turn a spark of doubt into a flame of destruction. As Mrs. Bantry prattled on about the upcoming parish fete, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the High Street, where life in St. Mary Mead continued its gentle flow. The tea shop, soon to be under new management, would reopen, and the village would move on, its surface calm restored. But Miss Marple knew that beneath that calm lay the same currents of human passion, love, anger, regret, that had led to Lawrence Redding's death. "You're awfully quiet, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, breaking into her thoughts. "What's on your mind? Planning your next case?" Miss Marple chuckled softly, picking up her knitting. "Oh, I hope not, Dolly. I much prefer a quiet life. But I do find that people are endlessly fascinating, don't you? So full of surprises, and yet so predictable in their ways." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You make it sound so simple, but I'd never have pieced it together. You're a wonder, Jane, truly." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her smile serene. "It's only a matter of noticing, my dear. The little things, the glance, the hesitation, the choice of a sugar cube over a plain cup of tea. They tell a story if one listens." As Mrs. Bantry took her leave, promising to return for tea the next day, Miss Marple remained in her garden, her eyes on the horizon. The village was quiet now, its secrets laid bare, but she knew that St. Mary Mead, like any place where people lived and loved, would always hold new stories waiting to be told. With a final sip of tea, she returned to her knitting, content in the knowledge that she would be ready, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, to unravel them when they came.